Andrei Bely's Petersburg is the best book of all time, which is a bold claim for me to make, considering I've never actually read it. Andrei Bely was born in 1880, he died in 1934. He was a member of this kind of obscure sect called the Symbolists that wrote a very particular, very certain type of book. I'm currently looking for more of them. But this seems to be the standout example. This is what Vladimir Nabokov called one of the four greatest masterworks of 20th century prose, a label that's exceedingly well deserved, as I can tell you having read it in the inferior English precisely twice. Now, this book can be summed up very simply and very quickly. It's the year 1905. The senator Apollon Apollonovich Ablyukov has a son named Nikolai, who has been contacted by revolutionaries who have tasked him to throw a bomb at his father. So you can explain it rather quickly, just like that. But of course, there's quite a bit more going on. Through a night and a day in the city of Petersburg, Bely explains the current problems of Russia, or current as of 1916 anyway, when it was published or finished. He explains the contradiction in terms between a westernized Petersburg and a sort of Russianized Petersburg. The city and the book are represented as this sort of problem between an excessively Russian kind of traditional, kind of shamanic idea of what Russia is, and then the westernized idea that was put forth by Peter the Great when he built the city on purpose. He kind of designed it in a Western way, as you might a Dutch city, and of course it's Petersburg, So it was kind of done like that on purpose, but it's this sort of Western logical imposition on an infinitely more ambiguous and airy and kind of mysterious Russian origin, which is a conflict best exemplified by the two main characters, Apollon and Nikolai Apollonovich. Apollonovich, the name, obviously it's got Apollo in it, so both of them have this sort of Nietzschean Apollonic streak of logic, cold hard Western sort of influence, put onto them kind of artificially as an outer layer by living in the city of Petersburg. And underneath that, and it's more obvious in the son than it is in the father, but they both have this kind of Tatar origin. The name Ablyukov is based off Ab-Lai, who was a Mongol leader, and then Ukhov, meaning ears, basically, in Russian. And so between the two of them, there's this sort of interplay between Eastern and Western Russia, as exemplified by the Mongol past and presumably the Western imposition upon that past. And Apollon Apollonovich is very much Apollo, while his son Nikolai is Dionysius. You can see that their portrayal in the book is sort of, the difference is that Apollon the father is more angular, he's more obsessed with geometry, because geometry was one of Bely's passions, and it makes for some very interesting passages. He's more precise, he's much more westernized, And his son, Nikolai, is more smoky. He inhabits more places. He's much more like a character in Dostoevsky in that he's sort of rushing about everywhere and he's constantly unsure of things. He's a very ambiguous sort of character. And this is further attested to in the style of prose. Part of Andrei Bely's theories about how writing worked was that the sounds of words should be just as important, of course, as the content of those words. And he believed that the sounds of P and L were these kind of these sorts of slimy, revolutionary sort of sounds. So you get Apollon, Apollonovich is this sort of a particular type of sound. And obviously that's one of the effects that's most obviously lost in translation into English. But I feel like having read at least one and a couple hundred pages of another translation. I've read the introductions as well, and they kind of explain it a bit. I feel I'm beginning to get an idea of what exactly I'm missing here. Just one of his techniques. For example, there's a character who appears kind of halfway through the book, who's named Pepovich Pep. And Pepovich Pep is meant to be the personification of the bomb that Nikolai is supposed to throw at his father. And Pep, of course, having this sort of outward, quick, rushing sort of sound, very bomb-like to me anyway. And of course, he's this imaginary character who appears in Nikolai's head, which kind of brings us into the next major idea explored by the book, which is transhumanism, transformation, things becoming human and things leaving their humanity behind to become something else. Almost all of the major characters in this book seem to have at least one transformative, kind of out-of-body experience. I don't remember who, but I think it's Alexander Dudkin, the fellow revolutionary who flies into space. I'm not sure if that's true. I know that he's the one who melds with the Bronze Horseman at the end of chapter 6, of course, which is my favorite part of the book. And then you have chapters. You have sections like Apollon Apollonovich flying above the earth and looking down at the prospect of St. Petersburg and imagining them covering the earth and sort of becoming a part of his surroundings. That's what the characters in this book do when they settle into a certain place, or when something overtakes them, when they're overtaken by an idea or a fantasy. They leave themselves and become part of the environment around them. I think almost everyone does it. I can't recall. I don't think the sergeant does it. But anyway, if you read the book yourself, you'll see how that kind of plays out. As well as being this sort of formal exploration of the state of being, the book is a picture of Russia in 1905 with all of that revolutionary fervor coming to a head as the bomb's timer ticks closer to the time of explosion. And, as we get further through the book, the chapters, though they don't necessarily get shorter, do seem to get more panicked and seem to get less and less of a focus on this sort of peripheral atmosphere of Petersburg in a shorter time. So if we skip around here at the beginning, there are lots of little passages, and this is true throughout the whole book. There's lots of little passages and small moments and extracts from people on the street moving around. And it's kind of meant to evoke the same atmosphere as this was John Reed's 10 Days That Shook the World, which is about the Russian Revolution, and it's just journalistic extracts of what it was like to live in Russia, it was Petrograd at the time, in St. Petersburg, on the eve of revolution. There's lots of short extracts of people jumping and sort of screaming and running about and getting shot and all sorts of things. In this, it's not quite that violent, because revolution hasn't yet happened, it's just about to, but it has this same uncertain sort of quality to it. And you can really see that in the short extracts. Which kind of brings me to the next point about this book, which is that it offers a lot of references to previous Russian literature, particularly, of course, the four major names, your Gogol, your Pushkin, your Tolstoy, your Dostoevsky. So it's Gogol in the sense that I was alluding to before. There's a lot of Petersburg tales in here. It's got the same sort of atmosphere. It's got characters who could very easily be reflections of Akaky Akakievich in the Overcoat. And you have people walking around in the streets who are described as noses in coats, It's that sort of oblique reference that reminds one, puts one in the frame of Gogol comedy. Because occasionally this book can be very funny. And I don't know, because obviously English reader, but I think it might be a very similar style of wryness to the humor. But then you get, of course, references to Pushkin abound. The Bronze Horseman is a character in the novel, and Nikolai Apollonovich assumes lots of the character of the superfluous man of Yevgeny Onegin as well. Tolstoy is referenced in a few different places, in descriptions mostly, as far as I can figure out. He's referenced in that, let's see, Apollon Apollonovich has very large green ears, just like Alexei Karenin, and Sofia Petrovna is described in the same way. And this is interesting, actually. So Sofia Petrovna, who's the wife of the sergeant, Sergei Sergeyevich Likutin, she's described both in the same terms as Grushenka and as somebody else in one of the Tolstoys at the same time, although I'm having trouble recalling exactly who at this time. So there's a double reference there, which is very interesting. Added to the fact, of course, that I mean, there's a patricide or an attempted patricide, which is very Dostoevsky, and the fact that I think precisely one point in the novel, somebody actually opens a door calmly and walks through it. Everybody else, it's either not mentioned or they're kind of bursting through the doors as quickly as possible in the most dramatic way they can, which is just typical. So it's kind of not a subset. It's a product of all of the Russian literature that came before it. I'm sure there's lots of references that are in here. I've been reading the footnotes in this edition, and they're extremely detailed, but we'll get to that. And they've got a lot more references in there, but those are the ones that I can just pick out off the top of my head. So that's why it's worth your time. Basically, it is more, to me at least, than one of the four greatest masters of 20th century prose. It's my favorite book of all time, even though I've never read it in Russian, which sounds ridiculous, but even compared to other English books, I think this trumps them all. And I'll tell you just a bit, just because we're coming to the end of this now, and I thought I'd just share a bit of my story with this book. I bought it many years ago, and the first time I read it, I absolutely detested it. I thought it was absolute garbage. I thought it was repetitive and horrible, and it is repetitive, but that's on purpose. Bely writes in the style of a poem. There's lots of sibilant repeating sounds that are meant to prove a point. And I didn't like that because I used to be a massive pleb and I thought it was horrible, and I sort of dropped it. I think, I mean, you can probably tell where I dropped it based on the roughness of the creases. I dropped it somewhere around here. Yeah, well, let's say here, page 91, so stupidly early. And I was reading the Macduff version, which is not that bad. I picked it up again just relatively recently, and I read it in about 2 days. I thought it was the best thing I'd ever read, so I immediately ordered a more in-depth translation, one that I've been told is a bit better, and that certainly seems to have much better footnotes. There's a footnote in this version that's almost every paragraph, and it explains so much about the novel that I didn't have any idea about the first time, even though I was reading the footnotes in this version. It seems to be intended for the general reader. But if you're going to read this book, and I mean, come on, you are. It's good. It's really good. Get this version. This is translated by Maguire and Malmstad. And there's a nice foreword as well, although I do tend to avoid reading those just because it colors my impression of what's to come. I actually did go through all of the introductory material in this version just because I'd already read the book. And again, it was really educational. So look, I've got nothing else to say. This is the best book I've ever read. Read it. There, where nothing but a foggy damp hung suspended, at first appeared the dull outline, then descended from heaven to earth the dingy, blackish-grey St. Isaac's Cathedral. At first appeared the outline, and then the full shape of the equestrian monument of Emperor Nicholas I. At its base, the shaggy hat of a Nicholas Grenadier thrust out of the fog. The carriage was flying toward Nevsky Prospect. Apollon Apollonovitch Ableukov was gently rocking on the satin seat cushions. He was cut off from the scum of the streets by 4 perpendicular walls. Thus he was isolated from people and from the red covers of the damp, trashy rags on sale right there at this intersection. Proportionality and symmetry soothed the senator's nerves, which had been irritated both by the irregularity of his domestic life and by the futile rotation of our wheel of state. His tastes were distinguished by their harmonious simplicity. Most of all, he loved the rectilineal prospect. This prospect reminded him of the flow of time between the 2 points of life. There the houses merged cube-like into a regular 5-story row. This row differed from the line of life, for many a wearer of diamond-studded decorations. As for so many other dignitaries, the middle of life's road had proven to be the termination of life's journey. Inspiration took possession of the senator's soul whenever the lacquered cube cut along the line of the Nevsky. There the numeration of the houses was visible, and the circulation went on. From there, on clear days, from far, far away, came the blinding blaze of the gold needle, the the clouds, the crimson ray of the sunset. There, from there, on foggy days, nothing, no one. And what was there were lines, the Neva and the islands. Probably in those distant days, when out of the mossy marshes rose high roofs and masts and spires, piercing the dank greenish fog in jags. On his shadowy sails the Flying Dutchman winged his way toward Petersburg from there, from the leaden expanses of the Baltic and German seas, in order here to erect, by delusion, his misty lands, and to give the name of islands to the wave of onrushing clouds. Apollon Apollonovitch did not like the islands. The population there was industrial and coarse. There the many thousand human swarm shuffled in the morning to the many chimneyed factories. The inhabitants of the islands are reckoned among the population of the empire. The general census has been introduced among them as well. Apollon Apollonovitch did not wish to think further. The islands must be crushed, riveted with the iron of the enormous bridge, skewered by the arrows of the prospects. While gazing dreamily into that illimitability of mists, the statesman suddenly expanded out of the black cube of the carriage in all directions, and soared above it. And he wanted the carriage to fly forward, the prospects to fly to meet him, prospect after prospect, so that the entire spherical surface of the planet should be embraced, as in serpent coils, by blackish grey cubes of houses, so that all the earth, crushed by prospects, in its lineal cosmic flight, should intersect with its rectilineal principle, unembraceable infinity, so that the network of parallel prospects, intersected by a network of prospects, should expand into the abysses of the universe in planes of squares and cubes, one square per solid citizen, so that, after the line, the figure which soothed him more than all other symmetries was the square. At times, for hours on end, he would lapse into an unthinking contemplation of pyramids, triangles, parallelepipeds, cubes, and trapezoids. While dwelling in the center of the black, perfect, satin-lined cube, Apollon Apollonovitch revelled at length in the quadrangular walls. Apollon Apollonovitch was born for solitary confinement. Only his love for the plane geometry of the state had invested him in the polyhedrality of a responsible position.